Chapter 17. We never had the chance. 1 month later, the guards abruptly informed us our work in the mission settlement was done, and we were being taken south to a garrison near the colony of St. Augustine. This colony was rumored to be the original Spanish settlement in these parts. After the announcement was made, I was summoned to the soldiers' quarters for a special meeting. A small group of soldiers were headed north, and they needed a man with survival and interpreter skills to accompany them. The invitation was accepted without hesitation. Unsuccessfully, I tried to convince them to allow Daniel to accompany the exploration party as well. He had been a great student, but they had no interest in 2 guides. It was difficult to accept not being able to help Daniel. We had become friends, and there had been a promise made to try to help him. However, I was elated to be headed in the direction of my imagined future rather than heading further away. The guards gave me immediate quarter alone in a newer storage shed. The next morning, the guards retrieved me for morning meal. The other prisoner sheds were eerily quiet. The other prisoners had already left for their southern destination. I never saw Daniel or any of the others again. We traveled the lands for the next 2 years, returning to San Luis only for the winter months. We were accompanied both years by a surveyor named Gaspar Odalis, who mapped the lands. The first year there were also 10 soldiers and a man of medicine they called Senor Pepito in the group. The main goal was to look for future mission and settlement sites. The first year, the party originally headed west, but came to a great river that was a barrier to further travel in that direction due to the strong currents and vast width. Most of the time was spent closer to the mountain range, I suspected was the same one I had visited years earlier with my French companions. This expedition was much farther south than the lands we had explored while fur trapping years earlier. Commandant Munoz was the leader. My role was quickly established as tracker, interpreter, hunter, and laborer. Whenever our band encountered other groups of European trappers or Indians, to the front I was marched to begin communications. When it came time to camp, many of the necessary setup tasks were mine. It was a return to the lifestyle I had grown to love during the time spent with the Wyandotte and then Jean-Luc and Claude. The soldiers were respectful, but kept their distance at first. Commandant Munoz had a quick temper and angry demeanor with everyone, but was believed to be fair. A few months after leaving the settlement at San Luis, we faced the first of several difficulties that year. On a rain-soaked, unseasonably cool early summer day, in a hilly region, we were forced to cross a small ravine. The fast-moving stream that had cut the ravine went on a long distance, both north and south of our location. We found an area where the ravine was only about the length of a man across. There was a small landing area with an incline to the left and a steep drop to the right. Commandant Munoz ordered me to jump across to the landing area first. With limited thought about possible consequences, the task was completed successfully. Munoz followed without incidents, as did 4 more soldiers in succession. Next up was a nervous-looking Gaspar, the surveyor, who upon landing lost his footing and rolled helplessly to the right. He clawed at the rocky terrain desperately as he slid toward the steep embankment. Nobody moved to help. On instinct, I grabbed the rapier from the belt of the nearest soldier. After 2 long strides, I jammed the weapon into a crack close to the edge of the cliff and slid toward the horrified Gaspar, just as he slid off the landing over the edge of the cliff. Luckily, the blade held securely as Gaspar latched onto my legs and held tight. Unfortunately, there was only room for my right hand on the sword handle, so my left hand was badly cut when I grabbed the blade to keep us from falling to the depths below. Within seconds, the nearby soldiers were beginning to haul us both up and away from certain death. Munoz responded with a reward. He placed an order that allowed me to carry both a rapier and knife during the day as we traveled. This proved very fortunate for Maximo Faustino, one of the soldiers. 3 weeks later, peril reared its head again. We had stopped at a shallow but fast-moving stream in a wooded area for a drink. No one heard or saw the 2 bear cubs on the other side of the stream until they bounded into the water directly across from us. Poor Maximo just happened to be closest to the cubs as Mother Bear burst through the thicket on the opposite side of the stream. Before he could even reach a weapon, the angry bear was upon him, determined to protect her young. The bear went for his head, but he thrust his arm forward into the bloodthirsty jaws as the bear latched on. The men closest to Maximo were scrambling away to safety. Again, on instinct, I did the opposite. The bear was over Maximo, swinging its head and poor Maximo side to side violently, with its back to me. Sprinting forward, searching frantically, my good hand finally grasped the knife it was seeking. I jumped on the bear's back, wrapping my legs tightly to the midsection of the bear. I threw my arms around the bear's neck. Just as the surprised bear released Maximo from its deadly jaws, I pulled the knife upwards toward the bear's throat with all my strength. Pain shot through my left hand and up the arm from the previous injury. There was a soft gasp and gurgle as warmth engulfed both hands before my body was launched violently through the air. The blue sky and thick forest rotated past before the stony ground took the breath from my helpless body. My mind was still sharp, and fear of the bear's retaliation gripped me while lying powerless, breathless on the stream's bank. Moments later, several soldiers appeared above in my line of vision. Some began cautiously helping me to my feet. One soldier raised my blood-soaked hands in the air, and all cheered. Maximo lay on the ground nearby, being tended to by Signor Pepito for the lacerations on his arm. The soldiers half carried me across the clearing to Maximo's side. The injured man thanked me in broken English, the first time I could recollect any Spanish soldier speaking the language, as tears of joy at being alive streamed down his face. All the members of the expedition the first year treated me differently after those 2 events. They still took away the weapons I carried during the day when we set up camp, and shackled my feet when we lay down to sleep, but I was otherwise treated as a companion rather than a prisoner. Even Commandant Munoz began to display kindness in our interactions, at least most of the time. Everyone began to share the labor of camp setup and breakdown. Maximo Faustino, whose last name ironically means lucky, and I became close friends. We faced many dangers and tense encounters with Indians together. We shared the stories of our lives. He told me about the far-off land called Spain, across the ocean where he grew up. In some ways it reminded me of stories my father had told of his life before he had crossed the ocean. The parts of Maximo's stories about the large cities and beautiful churches were especially familiar. I told him about my adventures and Roxbury, where I grew up. After he recovered from the injuries, Maximo was always at my side. When we encountered Indians, he would accompany me forward to communicate bravely with the often unpredictable tribes. The Indians we encountered were almost always willing to trade for the many items we carried for that purpose, but asked many questions, clearly suspicious about why the Spanish had come. I always responded that they only wished to learn about the land, careful to avoid divulging plans to settle missions or introduce new religions. When questioned about the interactions by Commandant Munoz, I described the natives as simple people who seemed only concerned with what they could gain. He seemed satisfied with this. Only Maximo came to know about my time with the Wyandotte. Only he came to understand how I really felt about these people that the rest viewed as savages. In the early fall, after turning south and heading back to San Luis, sickness overtook the expedition. Most showed at least mild symptoms. Several of us were gravely ill. For several days it was a struggle to even walk, despite our pace having slowed to a crawl. Skull-splitting pains drummed through the head, chills, weakness of the limbs, and fever had a crippling effect on the most unlucky of us. Finally, Maximo, who suffered only minor discomfort, convinced Munoz to let him take over all of my labor. Munoz even held camp for the next 5 days, allowing most to recover enough to continue. Those of us who were the most affected lay crippled during the seemingly endless days. There were moments when I began to feel that survival was unlikely. The dream of Abigail in the forest cabin from years before returned to bring on a feeling of calm in the darkest hour. One soldier named Juanito Reyes succumbed to the sickness and was sadly buried in the lonely forest. Maximo, spooked by the death, insisted on doing my chores for several more days after we resumed our march to allow time for me to recover. The loyalty and bond between us continued to deepen.